Have trouble attracting guys. Like, guys were always attracted to her for her beauty. She had a very unique look. A lot of people were definitely drawn to it.
She met my father in high school.
Obviously, her being just 16, there was a concern there of the age gap and maybe the influence that he had on the choices that she was making. I think my aunt and uncle were maybe torn because he presented himself very well, was very polite, and made very good conversation. And so I think in a way that impressed them.
My father had portrayed himself as he was like a little bit more stable, I guess, than other guys. He kind of portrayed like this kind of like bad boy vibe, and my mom was attracted to it.
I remember very distinctly the opportunity to meet him for the first time. She brought him to the house and he pulled up in the front of the house in a really nice car. He got out very handsome, just a beautiful looking man, dressed really nice. I kind of came from a rural setting where the boys never dressed like that. And so I was like, oh, something I would have seen in a movie. She became very consumed with her relationship with him. And often when I would try to call, this is before cell phones, so if I tried to call the house, my aunt or uncle would say, oh, she's not here, she's with Tom. I just remember very distinctly her infatuation with him.
Everyone thought the world of him. They thought he was so charming and so kind and so sweet. And I know my grandmother thought he was a good person. She thought he was a good man and thought that he treated my mother well. And at some point, he convinced her to run away with him.
They made the decision together to move to California. She didn't share a lot of details other than she was very excited about it.
I think he promised her a life and a family. My mother, she always wanted kids. She loved children. And I think he promised her this beautiful life together, that they could run away and build this wonderful dream together. They could have this life, have this family, and everything would be perfect.
There was a little bit of a ripple effect of shock because none of us knew. I remember that I felt very betrayed and I felt very hurt. And I remember going, what just happened? Like, how did this girl that was a very much an active part of our life, I would consider her one of my best friends. How did we go from that and these weekly conversations and this time well spent to not even knowing about her wedding, not even being invited to her wedding? I was very saddened that she had chose to run away and leave the family and leave school and leave her sports and leave us.
The hard truth is that they struggled in California. Unfortunately, it didn't work out the way he had sold it to my mother.
They had some problems in California. My father, he had gotten in trouble with an apartment complex. From what my grandmother tells me, my father would poke holes into walls and he would peep. He would watch people. But he was doing things that he shouldn't, and none of us really understood what that meant. It just appeared as though they were running away from whatever it was he got himself into. They came back to Colorado and they bought the house that me and my brother grew up in. I wish I could ask my mother what she thought or felt, but maybe she thought that if we have a baby, it'll change. Maybe everything will be okay. She found out she was pregnant with me, and I think she began looking for more support from her own family.
When Cheryl became pregnant with Shelby, a spark came back to her, and she was very excited about the prospects of being a mom. And then, of course, when Shelby arrived, then a few years later, Sean comes, and she was just so full of love and joy.
Having two children and having this family, I think it began to shift her focus, and I think that's when things started to change.
My mom's world stopped revolving around him, and that it started revolving around us, and that she was prioritizing us over prioritizing him. He liked to be the center of attention. He's just kind of like a narcissist that way, and only ever thought about himself. Coming back to Denver was kind of the beginning of the end. They just started experiencing a lot more problems, and my dad started to become more aggressive. He would yell, he would throw things, he would break things. And it scared her, it scared us.
I have a lot of memories from being a child and living in that house with my mother and my father. You know, I remember him reading me books, but I also remember him screaming and throwing things. And I remember my mother crying, and I remember just being terrified.
I began to notice a change in Cheryl. Something was just a little off. Her luster for life was very much diminished. It just seemed, when you were around them, it seemed very tumultuous and a lot of anxiety and nervousness.
There were times where he would start shouting, and him and my mother, they would argue in their bedroom. And I could see through the door, the crack in the door, I could see him yelling and screaming at her, and I'd see him hit her. I think she began to realize that maybe my father was not the man that she thought he was. He was not the person that she thought he was, and I think she knew that he was a danger to me and my brother. My father, he was charming and he was very charismatic. He was intelligent, he was good looking, he was easy to talk to, he was normal. But he was also terrifying to anyone that knew him. For my father, it was always about power and control. That's all it was ever about. He told me if I spoke or if I told anyone or talked about anything, he would hurt them.
I remember him making comments about Cheryl's looks, negative comments about her looks, and negative comments about her being a mother. I remember being pretty angry at the way he was treating her. She was always on alert, and she was always very concerned about what he was going to do to her or to her kids.
They were pretty broke. He struggled to maintain a job. He was just stuck, and he was stuck not being the priority. He was stuck having no power, no control, and of us coming first. When the emotional abuse, the yelling, breaking things wasn't effective anymore, he escalated in his behavior, get more physical.
I watched him hurt my mother. I watched him beat her, and he would scream at her. He would throw beer bottles.
When he started getting physical, she would have a bunch of bruises on her. And that sounded the alarm for a lot of people, and thought the best way to go was just to call law enforcement and have them deal with it.
When somebody calls to report a crime of domestic violence, they're obviously looking for help. In Cheryl's case, making the call to the Thornton Police Department at least initiated the start of a police response, the start of victim services, and the start of her journey through the court system. Kim was a victim's advocate, and they're a part of the detective division. They're a resource for the family, the victim's family, or the victim.
The first time I met Cheryl, she had reported to the Thornton Police Department that Tom had assaulted her. She would describe how he would grab her when she would try to leave the room. He would hit her. There was sexual abuse where it was like male privilege that she was going to have sex with him. And that was an experience that I believe that she had often. I think the scariest piece for Cheryl was her two children, Sean and Shelby. She was very fearful of Tom and his reactions.
He would get very angry. He would threaten to hurt us, or he would threaten to hurt my mother. Fear was what he used. He knew how to make people afraid.
Tom's abuse continued to get worse and worse. The more she stepped away and set those boundaries, the more aggressive, he got. She began to see the need to protect the kids even more.
I remember him throwing things against the wall, and I remember just being terrified. My mother was a very strong woman. Very, very strong. She was strong for me and my brother. And she always kept it together. She did her best to shield us from what was happening.
When she saw that Tom wasn't treating us right, I think it broke her heart. She was okay with him treating her like crap, but she wasn't okay with him treating her children like crap. And I think that was a huge push to leave him.
My mother reached out to the police department many times. She filed restraining orders, protective orders. Kim was helping my mother through all of these issues with my father.
She got a protection order as she gained more courage and was leaving the relationship.
She realized that, if she stayed with him, that she was gonna end up dead, that we were gonna end up dead.
I remember the day that we left, there were 2 suitcases in my closet, one for me, one for my brother. Well, my father, he told me to go get him a beer. I gave him the beer. And my mother, she told me to grab my brother, grab my suitcase, and get in the car. And that's exactly what I did. And as we're driving, pulling out of the driveway, my father comes out in a towel and he is screaming and yelling, and he throws the beer bottle. She was brave and she was strong, and it took so much courage for her to make that decision to leave, because leaving those relationships is dangerous and it can kill you.
I appreciate Cheryl's bravery so much. If someone is living in that situation with a manipulative, narcissistic, abusive person, by all means, get out.
I think one of the really positive things about Cheryl leaving the relationship was it really empowered her to be able to make her own decisions. As Cheryl began to leave that relationship, he was financially taking things away from her, not giving her, money to buy food, to buy clothes. Domestic violence is all about power and control and manipulation. She had to work more because he was not providing her the money that he said he was. He wasn't paying the bills. He wasn't doing the things that he needed to do.
My mother worked as a waitress. She worked a lot of hours. And my grandparents would help with me and my brother.
A lot of the time she was working 2 or 3 jobs just so we'd have a roof over our head and we'd have food and heat, and she would drop the world for us, and she would always put us first. She would do whatever she had to.
Because he still had visitation rights, she could potentially be harmed or could potentially have to deal with his anger and his wrath.
I do know that she felt very empowered that she was able to get out, but I also think that that was the moment that it was real. She knew at that point that things were going to get worse.
You're standing there in the doorway of the home I bought with my back and my credit, you thieving line.
Cheryl cared for those children deeply, and she worried about them, and she worried about leaving them with him.
Like, we never wanted to leave our mom's house. We never wanted to go over and go see our father because we were afraid of him.
So the weekends we would spend over at his house. There was one time where I got very upset. I got in a fight with my brother, and it was your typical sibling bickering. But my father, he had a very short temper. He shoved me into the linen closet in his bedroom. He locked the door. I don't know how long I was in there, but it was dark when I went in. It was light when I came out. I know I had peed myself at least once. He would come by, he'd knock on the door, he'd yell. It was dark. I didn't know when I was getting out. I didn't know why I was in there. I didn't know what was happening.
It's always scary when he lost control. He enjoyed it. He enjoyed causing people pain.
Me and my brother both had parakeets. One blue, one yellow. Mine got sick, and I spent all day trying to nurse it back to health. I remember at the end of the day, I told him, "Dad, my bird's still sick. My bird is still sick. What do I do?" He grabbed my bird, and he squeezed it so hard the eyes popped out of its head.
And it wasn't enough for him to kill the bird in front of us. He made my sister cook the bird, and I had to eat it. And he thought it was funny. Like whatever part of him he was missing, he felt complete by terrorizing us.
He was a monster. He had evil intent at every turn. I think his behavior just continued to escalate. Tom was not only manipulative, but he would watch her.
He would stand outside of that restraining order limit, and he would stand there and watch her just to let her know that he was watching her.
Cheryl, this is Tom. Don't ever presume to tell me where I'm supposed to be. There is no 100 yards. I'm on a public street, on a public sidewalk. You don't tell me what to do.
Some of the messages that I heard were just completely bone-chilling to me.
You don't tell me where to be. The next time you lie to the cops, like you have before, you're going to suffer the consequences.
My father, he was losing sense of control over my mother because she began building a life for herself. She cut ties from her abuser. She filed for divorce, and she became independent. So they were divorced, and he had a girlfriend. He was seeing Sue Beamer.
It was troubling. The first time I ever saw Sue, there was like some sort of resemblance to Cheryl in their stature. It was like replacing Cheryl in the relationship that he was in. So I definitely do not think that Tom was moving on. Tom manipulated Sue. I think Tom truly manipulated everyone that he ever came in contact with.
My mother didn't do a whole lot of dating. She took care of us. That was her world until she met Ross.
With Cheryl, everything was on the table. The first day we were together, she told me that she had 2 kids, and that was certainly the center of her life. She also told me she had a psycho stalker husband, and, if I was going to run, I should run now. She was fun. She was very outgoing. She was a joy to be with, and it wasn't just me who noticed that. Everyone noticed what a joy Cheryl was.
Ross and my mother, they fell in love. He treated her so well. He was good to her.
The very first time I met her, I gave her a key to my place. This was before we were even dating. I just said, "You're someone who needs a safe place to go. Here's a key to my place. Use it whenever you want."
She was getting her life together. She was working 2 jobs. She was going to school to be an accountant. She was fixing the house so her and Ross could move and start a new life.
Our lives became intertwined to the point where life without her was something that was no longer something I could imagine. We planned our future together because our present was together, and our present was so wonderful.
Tom became aware that she was about to move on without him, and she was going to take me and my brother with her. We were about to have a completely different life separate of him, and he couldn't stand it.
Tom's abuse continued to get worse and worse the stronger that Cheryl got. The more she stepped away and set those boundaries, the more aggressive he got. Once the perpetrator starts seeing that victim get stronger and stronger, the crazier and the more volatile that person becomes.
My guess is that this was kind of the tipping point for him. You know, knowing that she was with somebody who probably loved and adored her and treated her the way she deserved to be treated, probably just threw him into a downward spiral of evil.
He made blueberry pancakes and scrambled eggs. About an hour later, my head was foggy. Everything was spinning. At the time, I had no idea what was happening to me or why. So Tom gets on the phone, he calls my mother and convinces her that she needs to come pick me up because I am sick. I'm crying, and he puts me on the phone with my mother, and I'm begging her to come get me. So we get off the phone, and Tom takes me and my brother, and we go in the car and we go for a drive. We ended up in a bar, and Tom got a phone call, and it was Sue. Tom got very angry. He was throwing his hands, he was yelling, he was angry, and he said, "I have to go do something, I'll be back."
They had been exchanging the children at the police station, but hearing her daughter crying and saying she was sick, she let her guard down and actually went to Tom's to get Shelby.
I know one of the things that Cheryl and I talked about was that she should never, ever go to his house.
She was fearful of Tom, and so obviously the child exchanges taking place at the police department was basically for her safety.
She got the call about Shelby being sick, and then Cheryl went over there. Cheryl went up to the apartment. When she was let into the apartment, Sue was there. Sue kind of looked like maybe you really shouldn't be here.
911.
There's shooting over here.
Where's the guy that shot her at?
It was me.
It was you that shot her?
Yes, because he attacked me. There's shooting over here.
Where at?
In our apartment.
Who's been shot?
I think it was my boyfriend's ex-wife.
The 911 call comes into the Thornton Police Department, and that initiated the patrol response.
My boyfriend's ex-wife came in here and started yelling at me and screaming and grabbed a knife.
Why did you shoot her?
She came at me with a knife.
Susan, she made the 911 call. She was still on the phone with the dispatcher when the officers arrived. Other officers went into the apartment, found Cheryl's body, tried to administer life support with the assistance of paramedics, but she was obviously deceased. All we knew was that she had multiple gunshot wounds. We find multiple shell casings. Our CSI investigator was able to determine that Cheryl is running through the hallway where she shot twice in the back, and then she receives 2 more gunshot wounds, one to her upper chest and one to her thigh, and then there's a final gunshot wound which is in her head. The pathologist would tell us that the gunshot wound to the head could not have occurred as the first first wound. Tom arrived at the scene with Sean and Shelby around 9 p.m.-ish. When Tom shows up, there's still a large police presence, police outside his door.
I had never seen so many red and blue lights in my life. There was a fire truck, there was an ambulance, there were cops everywhere. And we got stopped by an officer, and he explained that my mother was shot and Susan was in the apartment.
Tom never asked what was going on. When he was asked, what does he know about what's going on, he refused to answer any questions.
Tom showed absolutely no concern. None. There was no expression, no concern for who had been shot, why, if Susan was okay, if my mother was okay. There was no concern for anyone. Me and my brother were taken to the police station. The officers, they tried to make us comfortable. They gave us water and crayons and a notepad. I drew pictures on that notepad that I still have to this day. I wrote that I missed my mother. I think I knew what had happened, I just couldn't comprehend it.
It was difficult to contemplate or realize what had happened. You don't really understand life and death as a child.
I went into the police department, got briefed about what had happened, and then I'd realized that Shelby and Sean were there.
Kim told us that my mother was dead. Overnight, my entire life had been turned upside down.
My whole world kind of crashed in. It's a call that no one ever wants to hear. It was a shock. It knocked me down.
I felt like I saw Shelby kind of suddenly take on like a new role with her brother.
It was almost like she had to take on the role of Cheryl and be a protector.
I believe it was about midnight before I interviewed Susan. Susan stated that Cheryl came over, said that I wasn't the mother of the children and I'll never be the mother. She pulled out a knife, and so I shot her. We obviously had a homicide. We had somebody who was confessing to it, and we had some physical evidence that showed that that person committed it. So that night, Susan Beamer was arrested and transported to jail on murder charges. I think there was always the sense that there was some involvement with Tom. It was just a matter of how much or, what role. We did talk to a neighbor. She saw Tom driving away in a hurry around 6 o'clock out of the apartment complex. Tom shows up at the police department and walks into the lobby. He said that I'm here for a child custody exchange. I want proof that I was here at the police department from 6 p.m. to 6:30. And the desk officer saw him arrive. I want to say it was around 6:20, 6:25. And so the officer would only write the time that he saw Tom there. He wrote on the card 6:30. So we thought Tom was trying to account for more time at the police department than he was actually there. What we knew about Tom certainly made him a person of interest. So Tom was brought in to the police department. That night, we did photographs of him. Tom didn't make any statements at the apartment. Tom didn't make any statements at the police department. So we certainly didn't have enough probable cause or any probable cause at that point to believe that he had any involvement in this. I don't think anyone was happy about letting Tom leave with no charges that evening, but legally, we had no choice.
I missed my mother. I couldn't understand that she was dead. I didn't talk about it. I didn't say anything until one day I did.
August of '98 is when Shelby provided her interview. saying that she heard Tom and Susan talk, changed the investigation.
She was blown away. I mean, she just could not believe the words coming out of my mouth.
Well, I heard my dad get up, so I went out to investigate.
Okay.
And I heard my daddy say, "Here, take this gun."
The night before she died, I was at Tom's apartment. And me and my brother, we were both sleeping. I remember Tom got out of bed.
Well, I heard my dad get up, so I went out to investigate.
Okay.
He had a gun in his hand. There was a little back and forth between the two of them.
And I heard my daddy say, "Here, take this gun and kill Cheryl."
Sue took the gun, and he told her he wanted to kill my mother, and the way he explained it to her is that they could get my mother out of the way and they could be together.
It was me. It was you that shot her?
Yes, because she attacked me.
Why did you shoot her?
She came at me with a knife.
The information we had from the 911 call and what the officers observed in the apartment didn't really match up. Susan didn't have any injuries, so self-defense obviously became questionable.
Of course, I thought it was Tom. They said it was actually Tom's girlfriend, which never made any sense to me.
By December of '98, Susan had now been in jail 4 to 5 months. With the permission and cooperation of her attorney, she wished to provide a statement. Her first statement is that there was no plan, but it was actually Tom who shot Cheryl. And right after Tom had shot and murdered Cheryl, hands her the gun and says, "Claim you did it, and if you don't, I'll kill your kids." I mean, she went from, "I did it in self-defense, Tom wasn't even here," to now, "Well, Tom did it, but I had no idea this was going to happen." That makes a little more sense, but it still doesn't make a lot of sense. Susan made her second statement. She finally came clean. Her part in this was that she was to keep Cheryl in the apartment until Tom got there.
He took the clothes off that he had, and the kids were actually down in the car, just sitting in the car waiting for their dad to come back.
When Tom came in, he was wearing a different shirt, he had black gloves on, and that's when Cheryl saw Tom and began to run down the hallway. And then the next thing Susan says is that she hears gunshots, Cheryl landing in the back room, and then more series of gunshots, which matches up with where the shell casings were found, at least. That makes more sense. She was then willing to testify against Tom.
As far as Susan Beamer goes, she made the plan with my father to kill my mother. They made the plan to take my mother's life.
August of '98, complete unrelated allegation against Tom had been reported to the Thornton Police Department. Not for the homicide, but for a sexual assault on a child. It was fortunate for us that he was arrested and incarcerated, so we knew where to find him. We served the arrest warrant while he was incarcerated. With most jury trials, it's very tense. I would say this was a little more than most. It was just, you could just feel the tension during each day of trial.
We certainly hoped there would be some justice. You know, the person responsible would be held accountable,
The prosecutor lays out the case in a pretty chronological order. Susan does testify against Tom.
I remember the day that Shelby testified in court. She was such a little trooper. And to have to sit there and talk about that day, the day that her mom died, in front of her dad, who was, just a short distance away, she was just so brave.
I remember being on the stand, and his lawyer approached me. His lawyer began by saying, "Can you tell me the difference between the truth and a lie?" And I told him one was real, the other was not. And I remember looking at my father in that orange jumpsuit.
I think as we began to get into the trial and really kind of unpack all of the years of abuse, I think it really shined a light that Cheryl was an incredibly strong person.
I do recall some phone messages that Cheryl had received, some kind of veiled threats. We knew who he was threatening and what he was threatening.
You and your boyfriend, your dad and your brother are cowards. I'm a man. I can tear them apart.
When the guilty verdict was announced, the judge gave immediate sentencing.
I was very relieved. I was very happy that finally this man who deserved no freedom, that he was put away for life.
I remember as we were walking out of the courtroom, Tom jumped up and he started yelling at Shelby.
What he actually said was, "I love you." And he was trying to convince me that he didn't do it and that it was all a lie. I remember having nightmares about that as a child. Just the look in his eyes and the anger. His hands were clenched. It took 4 officers to hold him back.
This isn't just a bad person. This is an evil person. It's a level of evil that, I would hope most people never see in their lifetime.
I think if you define evil, I would say Tom Rogers fits that definition.
I think Tom being convicted obviously was a win, but it was just one chapter in a lifetime of healing for those children.
He was not free to hurt anyone. He was not free to do as he pleased. I did find solace in it, and I, to this day, believe that he's exactly where he belongs.
I look back now and think about the time I was with her as being a gift. I wish I'd had more time, but I am thankful for the time I did have.
I put together a scrapbook with a bunch of pictures of my mother and me and my brother, and we still have that book to this day.
She would give everything for her family. I thank her every day, and I love her, and I always remember her with a smile on her face.
I remember her as being a strong, independent woman. I remember her as being a brave woman. And she taught me how to be brave. She never stopped fighting, and that's how I want to remember her. She was my hero.
On a cold night in Northern California, when the fog rolls in from the Pacific and swallows the highways whole, visibility becomes a fragile thing. Street lights turn into blurred halos. Tree lines vanish. Even familiar roads begin to feel unfamiliar, as if the landscape itself is watching quietly, waiting. In the late 1960s, these same roads were already carrying secrets. It began before anyone understood there was a pattern. Before the newspapers printed a name that would echo for decades. Before law enforcement realized, they were not dealing with a single impulsive act of violence, but with something far more deliberate, something patient, methodical, and disturbingly theatrical. A young couple sits in a parked car on a remote stretch of road. The world outside is still, almost unreal in its quietness. There is no traffic, no witnesses, no sense of danger. Just the soft hum of an engine cooling down, and the distant flicker of stars breaking through the California sky. They are ordinary people in an ordinary moment, unaware that they are already part of a story that will outlive them. Somewhere nearby, someone is watching. Not rushing. Not hesitating. Waiting, as if timing matters more than impulse. As if the act itself has been rehearsed in silence long before it is ever performed. When the violence finally comes, it does not arrive with chaos. It arrives with precision. And afterward, there is only silence again. At first, the authorities treat it as an isolated tragedy. A terrible crime, yes, but not one that suggests coordination or repetition. The kind of case that fills a file cabinet and eventually fades behind newer emergencies. There is grief, there are questions, and then there is the slow, bureaucratic rhythm of investigation. But something does not fit. There are details that feel wrong in a way that is difficult to articulate. The location is too deliberate. The timing too controlled. The lack of struggle too unsettling. It is not just what happened, it is how cleanly it happened, as if the act had been executed with intention rather than emotion. Weeks later, another incident occurs. This time, there is a survivor. A young woman, shaken and injured, manages to live through an attack that should have ended her life. She becomes the first living thread in a pattern no one has yet named. When investigators speak with her, they are not just collecting facts. They are trying to reconstruct a presence. A shadow. A figure that does not stay in one place long enough to be understood. She describes him in fragments. Not a full face. Not a complete identity. Just impressions, movement, voice, proximity, fear. The kind of memory that trauma preserves unevenly, where some details burn bright, and others disappear entirely. But even fragmented, her account carries something important: intentionality. This was not random. This was chosen. And then, something changes. Letters begin to arrive. At first, law enforcement assumes they are hoaxes. The kind that often follow sensational crimes. People seeking attention. People inserting themselves into tragedy from a safe distance. But these letters are different. They are not merely claims. They are performances. They are addressed to newspapers and police departments. They are written with confidence, almost theatrical in tone. The writer refers to himself not by a name given by others, but by a symbol he has chosen. A symbol that resembles something occult, something circular and self-contained, as if it belongs to a system of meaning only he understands. Inside the letters are messages that do not simply confess. They taunt. They challenge. They suggest a game in progress. And then come the codes. Strings of letters arranged in dense, deliberate blocks. Patterns that resemble language, but refuse to resolve into anything readable. It is not just communication, it is obstruction disguised as communication. A barrier placed between the writer and anyone attempting to understand him. For investigators, this is where the case stops being purely criminal and begins to feel psychological. Because the purpose is no longer just violence. It is recognition. He wants to be seen. He wants to be studied. He wants to remain unresolved. The media, of course, reacts quickly. A name emerges from the letters themselves, a self-assigned identity that the press adopts almost immediately. It is clean, memorable, and unsettlingly calm. It does not sound like a nickname. It sounds like a persona. Zodiac. Once the name enters circulation, it changes the case. It stops being a series of isolated incidents and becomes a narrative. Readers begin following updates the way they follow serialized fiction. Each new letter is analyzed. Each new code is debated. Each new claim of responsibility expands the mythology. But beneath the public fascination, there is something more troubling happening inside the investigation. The pattern is not tightening. It is expanding. Different locations. Different victims. Different methods. Yet the same presence. The same signature. The same deliberate attempt to communicate through violence and language at once. It is as if the perpetrator is testing boundaries, not just of law enforcement, but of public attention itself. And the most disturbing part is not what he does. It is how he controls the narrative afterward. He writes about his actions with detachment, sometimes even humor. He refers to lives taken as if they are entries in a ledger only he can see. He claims numbers far higher than what authorities can verify, forcing investigators into a position where they must constantly separate reality from performance. This creates a new kind of pressure. Every statement must be examined not just for truth, but for intent. Every claim becomes a potential distraction. Every code might be a clue or a trap. And still, the letters keep coming. Each one feels like a continuation of a conversation no one remembers starting. By now, fear has begun to spread beyond the immediate regions of the attacks. It is no longer just about specific roads or specific victims. It is about possibility. About the idea that someone could be anywhere, watching, waiting, choosing without warning. People begin to change their behavior in small ways. Couples avoid parking in isolated areas. Drivers check their mirrors more often. Conversations about safety become more frequent, more urgent. The sense of randomness becomes the most terrifying element of all, because it suggests that no amount of caution is enough. And yet, the killer is not hiding in the way most criminals hide. He is reaching out. Not retreating into anonymity, but stepping forward into attention. Engaging with it. Feeding it. Shaping it. That contradiction is what makes the case so enduringly disturbing. It is not simply that the identity remains unknown. It is that the unknown identity insists on being part of the story. Investigators begin to realize they are not only searching for a person. They are trying to interpret a mind that treats crime, communication, and recognition as interconnected elements of the same design. And somewhere within that design, there is a logic that has never fully been decoded. Not because the clues are missing, but because they may never have been meant to be solved in the first place. As the first phase of the investigation unfolds, one question begins to dominate everything that follows. Whoever Zodiac is he trying to be caught? Or is he trying to remain exactly where he is, forever halfway between presence and absence, speaking without being understood, acting without being fully seen, existing only in the narrow space between fear and curiosity? At this point in the story, there are no answers. Only patterns. And patterns, no matter how carefully constructed, always suggest a mind behind them. A mind that is still out there, somewhere in the fog of Northern California, watching as its own creation begins to take on a life of its own. On the surface, Northern California, in the late 1960s, looked like a place on the edge of modern optimism. The Bay Area was expanding. Highways were stretching farther into suburban landscapes, and young people were moving through a cultural shift that promised freedom, music, and reinvention. But beneath that surface, the geography itself was more fragmented than it appeared. Long stretches of open road separated small towns that rarely interacted with each other, and those empty corridors became spaces where visibility disappeared quickly once the sun went down. The police departments responsible for these counties were not unified in the way modern task forces are today. Each jurisdiction worked its own cases, guarded its own files, and often failed to connect patterns that crossed invisible administrative borders. A crime in one town might resemble a crime in another miles away, but without coordination, those similarities remained only suggestions, not evidence. In this environment, a killer who moved across jurisdictions could exist almost like a ghost stitched together from partial sightings. The early investigations into what would later be associated with the Zodiac case began separately, each treated as an isolated tragedy. Officers arrived at scenes where confusion still lingered in the air, where witnesses struggled to recall exact details, and where physical evidence offered little clarity. There were shell casings, damaged vehicles, disturbed earth, and the lingering absence of answers. But there was no unified narrative yet, no sense that these events were connected by anything more than coincidence. That sense of disconnection shaped everything that came after. Families of the victims were left in a painful limbo, receiving updates that were cautious and limited. Detectives were careful not to promise patterns they could not yet prove. In interviews, they often returned to the same uncertainty, whether they were dealing with a series of unrelated attacks, or something more coordinated. It was a question that carried weight not only for investigative direction, but for public fear. Because if the crimes were connected, then the danger was not local or isolated. It was mobile. And mobility, in a landscape of highways and fog, meant unpredictability. As the months passed, the atmosphere around the case began to shift. The first reports that hinted at a connected offender were not immediately accepted. It is difficult for institutions to reorganize their understanding of violence while it is still unfolding. But the emergence of communication from the perpetrator forced that change. The arrival of letters, written with unusual confidence and theatrical tone, suggested that whoever was responsible was not simply acting in silence. He was observing the response. This changed the psychological dimension of the investigation. Detectives were no longer only analyzing physical evidence. They were now interpreting intention embedded in language. Every phrase in the letters was examined for hidden meaning. Every claim was compared against known cases. Every symbol became a possible clue. But the challenge was that the writer did not behave like a typical offender seeking concealment. Instead, he behaved like someone constructing an identity in real time, adjusting tone depending on how the public reacted. The effect was destabilizing. At police stations, bulletin boards filled with maps marking incident locations began to accumulate overlapping pins. Red strings connected points that spanned counties. Patterns appeared, then dissolved under closer inspection. The idea of a single perpetrator moving through these spaces was both compelling and frustrating, because it explained too much while proving too little. Meanwhile, journalists began to play a significant role in shaping the case's identity. Newspapers were not passive observers. They were active participants in how the story developed. The publication of letters, the reproduction of symbols, and the coverage of claims all contributed to amplifying the presence of the unknown writer. With each article, the figure behind the attacks became more defined in the public imagination, even as his real identity remained entirely absent. This tension between visibility and invisibility became central to the case. Inside police departments, there were growing disagreements about how seriously to take the communications. Some investigators believed the letters were the work of a calculated individual attempting to manipulate attention. Others thought they might be hoaxes designed to confuse or divert resources. But as more correspondences arrived, the consistency in tone and knowledge suggested something more deliberate than random imitation. The killer, whoever he was, appeared to understand both fear and attention as tools. He referenced details from crime scenes that were not publicly released at the time, which suggested either direct involvement or access to information not available to the general public. This forced investigators to reconsider assumptions about exposure. It was no longer safe to assume that details of the crimes were contained within official channels. Information itself had become porous. At the same time, public fear began to shift from abstract concern into behavioral change. People altered how they used public spaces. Couples avoided isolated roads at night. Drivers became more aware of surrounding vehicles, especially in areas where fog reduced visibility. The geography of everyday life was being quietly reshaped by the idea that an unseen observer could be anywhere. What made this particularly unsettling was the randomness implied by the attacks. There was no consistent victim profile that could be easily categorized. There was no obvious personal connection between victims and perpetrator. This absence of relational logic created a sense of vulnerability that extended beyond the immediate cases. It suggested that ordinary life itself could be interrupted without warning. For investigators, this created a second layer of urgency. They were not only trying to identify a suspect. They were trying to restore a sense of predictability to events that seemed designed to resist it. In interviews with survivors, fragments of memory became critical. One survivor described the presence of the attacker in terms that were difficult to fully reconstruct later. Not because the account was unreliable, but because trauma often preserves sensation rather than structure. What remained was not a clean narrative, but impressions, a figure moving with confidence, a sense of control, the unsettling feeling that the situation had been anticipated. These accounts contributed to a growing profile, but the profile itself remained incomplete. As investigators attempted to synthesize all available information, another complication emerged: the killer's claims of additional victims beyond those confirmed. These claims expanded the perceived scale of the threat, even though they could not be verified. Each new letter potentially increased the number of unknown cases that might be connected, forcing law enforcement to revisit older files, re-examine cold cases, and consider possibilities that had previously been dismissed. The investigation became less like a straight path and more like a widening web. Yet despite this expansion, the core problem remained unchanged. There was still no identity. No confirmed suspect who could be definitively linked to all incidents. No physical evidence that tied the cases together in a way that would hold in court. Everything pointed toward a presence, but nothing resolved into a person. And in that gap between presence and identity, the figure known as Zodiac began to take on something larger than any single investigation could contain. He was no longer just a suspect in a series of crimes. He had become a question embedded in the system itself. A question that would continue to grow more complex with every failed attempt to answer it. On a summer afternoon in Northern California, the kind of afternoon that looks almost too ordinary to carry anything violent within it, the lives of the victims later associated with the Zodiac case were not marked by fear or anticipation. They were marked by routine. School schedules, weekend plans, casual drives, conversations that would never be remembered in detail. That normality is what makes the story so difficult to process in hindsight, because nothing about the moments leading up to the attacks suggested that they were part of something larger. Each victim had a life that existed entirely outside the frame of the investigation that would later define them. They were not symbols at the time. They were not entries in a case file. They were simply people moving through the predictable rhythm of their age and environment. In one instance, a young couple spent an evening together in a parked car near a quiet roadside area. It was the kind of place chosen for privacy rather than isolation, a place where teenagers and young adults often gathered away from the attention of family or the constraints of public space. There was laughter, small talk, the comfortable silence that comes when two people are familiar with each other's presence. The air was still, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and warm asphalt cooling after sunset. What they did not know was that this ordinary moment would later be reconstructed repeatedly by investigators, journalists, and strangers trying to understand how violence could enter so seamlessly into such a scene. The attack that followed would later be analyzed in terms of timing, positioning, and method, but at the time it was experienced only as sudden disruption. There was no warning that could be identified in retrospect. No interaction that suggested escalation. The violence arrived as an interruption that did not belong to the environment it entered. For those who survived encounters attributed to the same offender, the psychological impact became as significant as the physical injuries. One survivor in particular would later provide one of the most important early descriptions of the attacker, though even that description was incomplete in the way trauma often preserves memory. Certain details were sharp, such as the sense of proximity, the controlled manner of movement, and the unsettling calm that seemed to accompany the presence of the attacker. Other details were fragmented, as if the mind had deliberately refused to store them in full clarity. What remained consistent across accounts was not appearance, but behavior. There was a sense of deliberation, a lack of visible panic or hesitation. This was not someone acting in emotional overflow. It was someone who appeared to be following an internal structure, a sequence understood only by him. When investigators later attempted to reconstruct the early victim's final hours, they faced the difficulty of separating ordinary life from the moment of rupture. Friends and family could describe personalities, habits, and recent events, but there was nothing in those descriptions that pointed toward selection criteria. There was no shared social circle, no clear behavioral pattern among victims that would suggest targeted reasoning. This absence of connection became one of the earliest psychological puzzles in the case. It forced a shift in investigative thinking. Instead of asking why these specific individuals were chosen, detectives began to consider whether selection was based on opportunity alone. If that were true, then the randomness itself became part of the terror, because it implied that anyone in a similar environment could have been placed in the same position. As these early cases were being reviewed, a new and more complex layer of the investigation began to emerge through communication from the offender. The letters that arrived at newspapers and law enforcement agencies were not simply confessions. They were structured expressions of identity. Within them, the writer constructed a version of himself that was separate from the physical world in which the crimes occurred. He was no longer just an unknown assailant. He was becoming a narrator of his own actions. The tone of these communications was calm in a way that contrasted sharply with the violence they referenced. There was no visible emotional turbulence. Instead, there was calculation, even a kind of detachment that made the content more disturbing than overt rage would have been. The writer referred to himself using a symbol that functioned like a mask, an identity that could be repeated and recognized without revealing anything concrete about the person behind it. This symbolic identity allowed him to exist in two spaces at once. In one, he was an actor moving through physical environments. In the other, he was a constructed figure interacting with media and law enforcement through language alone. The psychological effect of this dual presence was significant. Investigators were now dealing with a subject who could shape perception without being physically present. Each letter influenced public fear, redirected investigative attention, and introduced new layers of uncertainty. The offender was not only committing crimes. He was actively participating in how those crimes were understood. As more correspondence arrived, the content began to shift in subtle ways. There were claims of additional victims that extended beyond confirmed cases. There were references to actions not yet linked to official reports. These statements forced investigators to revisit unresolved disappearances and older unsolved files, expanding the scope of the investigation far beyond its original boundaries. At the same time, the public began to internalize the idea that the attacker was not confined to a single moment or location. The fear was no longer attached to specific roads or cities. It became conceptual. It was the idea that an unknown individual could appear unpredictably and leave no immediate trace of identity. This conceptual fear had a different psychological weight. It did not rely on proximity. It relied on possibility. Inside investigative offices, maps grew more complex as potential connections were drawn between cases across different jurisdictions. But complexity did not automatically produce clarity. In many ways, it produced the opposite. The more information was gathered, the more difficult it became to determine which details were relevant and which were coincidental. Every new piece of data introduced additional branching interpretations. Meanwhile, the victims' families continued to live with the aftermath in a very different way than the public narrative. For them, the case was not an intellectual puzzle or a media phenomenon. It was a permanent absence that no amount of investigation could restore. The attention surrounding the case sometimes created a secondary burden, as private grief became entangled with public fascination. In this environment, the identity of the attacker began to overshadow the individuals who had been affected. The symbol he created became more widely recognized than the names of those he targeted. This imbalance would later become one of the most troubling cultural aspects of the case, as the figure of the unknown offender expanded in visibility, while the victims receded into historical footnotes. Even within law enforcement, there was an awareness that the case was evolving into something larger than a standard criminal investigation. It was becoming a study of behavior, communication, and identity construction. The offender's ability to control narrative through letters introduced a dynamic where perception itself became a battleground. And still, beneath all of this complexity, the core reality remained unchanged. There was a series of lives interrupted without warning. A series of environments that shifted instantly from normality to irreversible loss. And a presence that moved between those moments without ever fully being seen. The more investigators tried to define him, the more he seemed to exist in the space between definitions. Not fully visible. Not fully absent. But always present in the aftermath, where questions remained longer than answers ever could. What defines a moment of terror is not always the violence itself, but the transition into it. The instant when a normal environment stops behaving like a normal environment. When time no longer feels continuous. When a place that was safe seconds ago becomes something entirely different, without warning or explanation. In the case of the killings attributed to Zodiac, that transition appears repeatedly, almost like a signature in itself. It begins on a stretch of road that is not remarkable in daylight, but becomes almost unreal at night. The kind of road where headlights stretch too far ahead into darkness, and where the edges of the world seem to dissolve into open space. In the late hours, cars pass infrequently. Conversations inside vehicles feel private, almost sealed off from the rest of the world. On one such night, two young people sit together in a parked car. They are not doing anything unusual. There is no argument, no distress, no anticipation of danger. Their world is small in that moment, defined by the interior of the vehicle and the quiet outside it. The engine is off or idling low, and the air carries the stillness of rural California after dark. What they do not notice is how long another presence may have been nearby. Not rushing. Not announcing itself. Simply positioned at a distance that allows observation without interruption. When the first act of violence occurs in the sequence of events, it does so without spectacle. There is no dramatic build-up visible to the victims, no warning that can be recalled afterward as a missed signal. Instead, there is a sudden rupture, as if the world itself has been punctured. The sense of control that existed seconds earlier disappears completely, replaced by confusion that arrives faster than comprehension can form. In the aftermath, investigators arrive to a scene that tells a story in fragments rather than clarity. The positioning of the vehicle, the absence of clear struggle in expected ways, the suddenness of the outcome, all of it suggests a level of decisiveness that is difficult to interpret emotionally. It is not simply that something violent occurred. It is that it occurred with a sense of completion, as if the act followed a predetermined internal structure. Months later, another incident takes place on a holiday night, when public attention is directed elsewhere and roads are again lightly traveled. This time, the outcome is different in a way that complicates the investigation. There is a survivor. Her experience becomes one of the most important threads in reconstructing the behavior of the attacker. But like many accounts formed under extreme stress, it does not arrive as a clean narrative. It arrives in impressions. The sense of someone approaching with confidence rather than hesitation. The feeling that the situation had been controlled from the moment of first contact. The inability to fully process how quickly the shift from normal interaction to life-threatening danger occurred. She later struggles, as many survivors do, with the uneven nature of memory. Some details are sharp enough to feel invasive in their clarity. Others are missing entirely, as if the mind refused to record them. What remains consistent is the emotional imprint, the presence of control on the part of the attacker, and helplessness on the part of those targeted. For investigators, this case does not immediately connect to earlier incidents in a formal way. At first, it is treated as a separate event. But patterns begin to emerge in hindsight. The geography is not identical, but it is close enough to raise questions. The timing is not linked, but the method suggests similarities that cannot be ignored. Still, without confirmation, these remain hypotheses rather than conclusions. And then, the pattern shifts again. The next incident occurs in a different environment entirely. No longer just roadside isolation, but a recreational space where people might assume daylight, or public familiarity offers some protection. A couple spends time near a lake area, a place chosen for privacy, but not complete isolation. The setting is open, exposed in ways that make concealment more difficult. Yet even in this more visible environment, the same transformation occurs. The attacker is no longer only distant or hidden. This time, he enters the space directly. What makes this moment particularly unsettling is not just the presence of violence, but the manner in which it is staged. There is an attempt to control the environment itself, to transform an open public space into something enclosed and private. The victims are no longer simply caught in a sudden encounter. They are placed into a situation that feels structured, almost ritualized in its sequence. There is restraint involved, a deliberate slowing of time. The attacker does not behave as someone acting in uncontrolled aggression. Instead, there is a sense of intention in the way the situation unfolds, as if every step is part of a mental script being followed to completion. For those who later examine the scene, this incident stands apart from the earlier ones. It introduces a level of proximity, an interaction, that changes the profile of the unknown offender. It suggests not only willingness to approach victims directly, but comfort in sustaining presence within close range for extended periods. And then, the most public and urban of the incidents occurs. In a city environment, where the assumption of safety is shaped by density, light, and movement, a taxi driver becomes the next victim. This setting changes everything about how the case is perceived. It is no longer confined to isolated roads or recreational areas. It has entered a space defined by routine human interaction, where strangers enter vehicles and brief conversations are part of daily life. The attacker here is not hidden in landscape or distance. He is inside a system of trust that exists in everyday urban life. The encounter begins as something ordinary, a fare, a destination, a short exchange that would normally fade from memory. The driver performs his routine, navigating familiar streets, unaware that the journey is becoming part of a larger pattern. The passenger remains composed, unremarkable in behavior, blending into the expectation of normality that defines such interactions. But at some point during the ride, that expectation is broken. The violence that follows is contained within a small, enclosed space, making escape, or external intervention nearly impossible. The city outside continues moving, unaware that a private catastrophe is unfolding within one of its many vehicles. Streetlights pass over the taxi, illuminating it briefly before it disappears again into shadowed blocks. What makes this incident particularly significant for investigators is not only the location, but the implication. The offender has now demonstrated adaptability across environments. Remote roads, recreational areas, and urban settings are all within reach. There is no single type of terrain that defines where he can operate. This removes one of the key assumptions that investigators often rely on: environmental predictability. After this event, the psychological weight of the case increases dramatically. The idea that the attacker can transition between such different spaces suggests a level of confidence and mobility that is difficult to contain within traditional investigative frameworks. It also reinforces the perception that the offender is not constrained by fear of exposure in the way many criminals are. Instead, there is a sense of movement guided by internal logic rather than external pressure. At the same time, public awareness of the case intensifies. The incidents are no longer isolated reports. They are now part of a developing narrative that is being followed closely, discussed widely, and increasingly feared. Each new detail contributes to a growing sense that the offender is not only active, but evolving in how he chooses environments and engages with victims. For the families of those affected, however, there is no narrative coherence to any of it. There is only interruption. The sudden absence of a person who was present moments before. The inability to reconcile normal last interactions with irreversible loss. And for investigators, there is a growing realization that the most difficult aspect of the case is not reconstructing what happened after the fact, but understanding how the offender moves between such different contexts, without leaving a trace that can be followed with certainty. By the end of this sequence of events, the figure known as Zodiac is no longer defined by a single method or location. He is defined by transition itself. The ability to move from silence to action, from distance to proximity, from rural emptiness to urban density, without ever revealing the underlying identity that connects all of it together. And in that ability, the central problem of the case becomes clear. Not just what happened in each moment, but how the same unseen presence could exist in all of them at once, without ever becoming visible enough to stop. What remains after violence is often quieter than people expect. Not silence in the emotional sense, but literal absence. The world does not pause to acknowledge what has happened. Cars continue passing on distant roads. Wind continues moving through trees. Light changes angle as the day progresses. But within the space where the incident occurred, something fundamental has shifted, and it is only those who arrive afterward who can feel it. In the case of the early Zodiac-linked killings, discovery did not arrive as a single moment of clarity. It arrived in stages, each one adding another layer of uncertainty to something that was already difficult to understand. The first officers on scene often described an initial sense of confusion that came before interpretation. They were trained to recognize patterns of violence, but what they encountered in these locations did not always align neatly with expectations. There was the physical reality of what had occurred, but there was also the emotional residue that lingered in the environment itself, something harder to document in reports. At a roadside location outside Benicia, the discovery began with a call that lacked detail. A report of possible gunfire, a vehicle that had not moved for an unusual amount of time, a stretch of road that felt wrong to someone passing through it. When officers arrived, they did not immediately understand what they were seeing. The car was there, positioned in a way that suggested it had stopped voluntarily. Nothing about it initially indicated the full severity of what had taken place inside or around it. Only when they approached closer did the reality begin to form. The interior carried the stillness that follows irreversible violence. There was no motion, no sound, no sign that anyone inside could respond. The environment outside remained unchanged, which created a disturbing contrast. The world had continued normally around something that had already ended. For investigators, these early discoveries were not yet part of a connected narrative. Each scene was treated as its own event, with its own timeline and its own set of unknowns. There was no immediate assumption that a single offender was responsible. In fact, the idea that these incidents were linked was still speculative, resting on similarities that had not yet been formally confirmed. But patterns have a way of becoming visible slowly, not all at once. At the second major scene, discovered months later, the environment was different, but the sense of disruption was similar. This time, there were signs of survival as well as loss, which introduced complexity into the interpretation. A survivor's presence meant that the scene was not only about what had ended, but also about what had continued. This duality created a different investigative atmosphere, one that required both forensic precision and careful psychological consideration. Officers who interviewed the survivor noted that her recollection did not unfold in a linear fashion. Instead, it came in fragments that needed to be gently assembled. Certain details stood out sharply, while others remained indistinct, as if the mind had selectively preserved only what was necessary for survival. What became important was not just what she remembered, but how she remembered it. The sequence of impressions suggested a rapid shift from normal interaction to threat, without a clear transitional phase that could be easily identified. At this stage, investigators began to consider whether they were dealing with a perpetrator who relied on speed and control rather than prolonged engagement. The idea of control became central to how scenes were interpreted. Not control in the sense of physical dominance alone, but control over timing, environment, and perception. The third discovery introduced a different emotional register entirely. In a recreational area that had once been associated with leisure and safety, the presence of violence felt almost incompatible with the surroundings. The lake environment, open and exposed, was not the kind of place typically associated with concealment. Yet when officers arrived, they found that the openness of the setting had not prevented the event from occurring. Instead, it had been incorporated into it. The scene itself required careful reconstruction. There were signs that the environment had been deliberately engaged with, not just used as a backdrop. Objects were repositioned in ways that suggested interaction rather than randomness. The space felt transformed, as if its ordinary function had been interrupted and redirected toward something else entirely. Forensic teams worked slowly, aware that every detail might carry significance that was not immediately obvious. But even with careful documentation, there was a persistent difficulty in interpreting intention. Physical evidence could describe movement, contact, and sequence, but it could not easily explain meaning. And meaning, in this case, seemed to matter as much as mechanics. The discovery that changed the trajectory of the investigation most significantly came from an entirely different context: communication. After the early scenes had been processed and initial reports circulated internally, letters began to arrive at media offices and law enforcement departments. These communications were not immediately understood as extensions of the same cases. At first, they were treated as separate phenomena, potentially unrelated expressions of attention-seeking behavior. But as investigators examined the content more closely, similarities began to emerge that could not be ignored. The language used in the letters reflected knowledge that was not widely available to the public. Certain details corresponded with specific aspects of crime scenes that had not been released through official channels. This created a critical problem for investigators, because it suggested that the author either had direct involvement or had access to privileged information. The tone of the letters also stood out. There was no hesitation in the writing. No indication of uncertainty. Instead, there was a structured confidence that felt almost detached from emotional fluctuation. The writer referred to events as if they were part of a larger design, something ongoing rather than concluded. What made this particularly unsettling was not just the content, but the timing. The letters often arrived after key investigative moments, as if responding to developments in real time. This created the impression of an observer who was not only aware of the investigation, but actively engaged with its progress. At this point, the discovery phase of the investigation expanded beyond physical crime scenes into the realm of interpretation. Investigators were now dealing with two parallel sets of evidence: the tangible remnants of violent events, and the intangible, but increasingly influential communications attributed to the same source. The integration of these two streams of information was not straightforward. Physical evidence followed forensic logic. It could be tested, compared, and catalogued. The letters, however, operated in a different space. They required interpretation, context, and caution, because they could easily distort understanding if taken at face value. Still, the convergence between the two could not be dismissed. As more discoveries accumulated, a pattern began to form that was less about individual incidents and more about consistency of presence. The same sense of control appeared across different environments. The same absence of identifiable connection between victims. The same inability to establish a clear trajectory leading toward the offender's identity. Even in scenes where time had passed and evidence had begun to degrade, there remained an underlying sense that the events were not random in structure, even if they were difficult to decode in purpose. For families of the victims, these discoveries were not abstract investigative milestones. They were moments that confirmed irreversible absence. Each report, each confirmation, each new detail added to an understanding that something final had occurred, even if the explanation remained incomplete. For investigators, however, each discovery raised as many questions as it answered. The physical scenes confirmed that events had taken place. The communications suggested that someone was aware of those events in real time. But the connection between the two, while strongly implied, was not fully proven in a way that could definitively identify a single responsible individual. And so the discovery phase of the case became something unusual. Not a conclusion of investigation, but an expansion of uncertainty. Each new piece of evidence illuminated part of the structure, while simultaneously revealing how much of it remained hidden. By the time multiple scenes had been analyzed and the letters continued to arrive, one fact had become increasingly difficult to avoid. This was not a case defined solely by what happened at each location. It was a case defined by the presence that moved between them, leaving behind not just physical traces, but questions that seemed designed to outlast the evidence itself. As the investigation expanded, it began to resemble less of a straight path toward an answer and more of a widening maze where every corridor led to another locked door. What had started as a series of isolated violent incidents was now an interconnected web of reports, letters, witness statements, and partial forensic interpretations. Each piece seemed significant on its own, but when placed together, they refused to form a complete picture. Detectives working across different jurisdictions faced an immediate and fundamental problem. They were not operating as a single unified force. Each county had its own procedures, its own evidence handling systems, and its own priorities. Communication between agencies existed, but it was slow, formal, and often delayed by administrative boundaries that did not reflect the reality of the case. In practical terms, this meant that information that could have been critical in the early stages of connection was often shared only after time had already eroded its immediate usefulness. This fragmentation created space for uncertainty to grow. In one office, investigators focused on ballistic evidence. In another, attention was directed toward survivor testimony. Elsewhere, analysts spent hours examining the handwritten letters, comparing strokes, pressure patterns, and linguistic habits in search of anything that could narrow down the identity of the writer. But these efforts were not always synchronized, and without synchronization, patterns that required cross-referencing remained incomplete. One of the earliest major obstacles was the lack of a consistent suspect profile. Normally, investigators build profiles by identifying behavioral patterns across incidents. But in this case, the variability of environments and methods made that difficult. The offender did not appear to follow a single predictable operational structure. Instead, there was flexibility, adaptation, and a disturbing willingness to shift approach depending on context. This adaptability led some investigators to initially question whether all the cases were even connected. The idea that multiple offenders might be responsible for similar, but unrelated incidents was seriously considered. It was a logical response to the inconsistencies in method and location. However, the emergence of communications claiming responsibility complicated this theory. The letters introduced an external narrative that tied events together in a way that physical evidence alone had not yet fully established. Still, even with the letters, certainty remained elusive. Handwriting analysis produced inconclusive results that suggested consistency in authorship across multiple communications, but not enough to identify a specific individual. Linguistic patterns were studied in detail, revealing a voice that was confident, performative, and structured in a way that suggested deliberate crafting rather than spontaneous expression. Yet none of these findings could translate into a name. Investigators also explored the possibility that the offender had prior experience with systems of communication, perhaps someone familiar with codes, ciphers, or structured symbolic thinking. This line of inquiry was influenced by the content of the letters themselves, which included encrypted messages that required significant effort to decode. The presence of these ciphers suggested not only intelligence, but also patience and a desire to create barriers between message and meaning. The investigative teams dedicated significant resources to breaking these codes. Mathematicians, linguists, and cryptographic specialists were consulted. Some portions of the messages were eventually deciphered, but even when meaning was extracted, it rarely provided direct identification. Instead, the decoded content often reinforced the psychological presence of the writer rather than revealing his identity. At the same time, witness statements continued to accumulate, though they varied in reliability. Memory under stress is inherently unstable, and many descriptions differed in small but important ways. Height estimates shifted between accounts. Clothing details were inconsistent. Even facial features were reported differently depending on the time elapsed between event and interview. Investigators had to carefully weigh each statement against physical evidence, knowing that human perception under extreme conditions is often fragmented. One of the most persistent challenges was the absence of a clear departure trail. In many criminal cases, the pathway away from the scene provides critical leads, vehicles, footprints, witness sightings, or environmental disturbances. In this case, however, the offender seemed to vanish without leaving a trace that could be confidently followed. This lack of continuity, after the events, created a gap in the investigative timeline that was never fully closed. As the case progressed, attention turned toward individuals who might fit partial aspects of the behavioral and geographic profile. This phase of the investigation produced numerous persons of interest, each evaluated based on proximity, background, and circumstantial associations. Among them were individuals with military experience, others with technical or mathematical backgrounds, and some who had prior minor encounters with law enforcement. One suspect in particular, later heavily discussed in public discourse, matched several behavioral and circumstantial elements that made him a focal point of investigation. However, despite extensive questioning and analysis, no definitive evidence linked him conclusively to all incidents. The absence of physical proof remained the central obstacle that no profile or theory could overcome. As investigative pressure increased, so did public attention. Media coverage intensified, and with it came a wave of speculation that often extended beyond verified information. Newspapers published theories, commentators proposed identities, and the public engaged in widespread analysis of available details. While this attention helped maintain awareness of the case, it also complicated investigative efforts by introducing noise into the informational environment. Law enforcement agencies had to constantly separate credible leads from those generated by public speculation. Some tips were useful, but many led to dead ends or unrelated individuals. The sheer volume of information became a burden in itself, requiring additional resources simply to filter and evaluate incoming data. Inside investigative offices, walls were covered with maps, timelines, and photographs. Red strings connected incidents across counties. Notes were layered over earlier notes as new information replaced or contradicted older assumptions. The physical representation of the case reflected its psychological state, dense, overlapping, and incomplete. Despite all of this effort, the central question remained unchanged. Who was responsible? Not in a speculative sense, but in a provable one. Who could be placed at each scene, tied to each communication, and supported by evidence that would hold under legal scrutiny? This gap between belief and proof became the defining feature of the investigation. The more information was gathered, the more complex the picture became. But complexity did not equal clarity. In fact, in many ways, it increased the distance between investigators and resolution. There were moments when it seemed as though the case was close to breaking open. A promising lead would emerge, a suspect would be identified, a piece of evidence would appear to align multiple threads. But each time, something would fail to fully connect. A missing detail, an unverified alibi, an inconclusive forensic result. These small failures accumulated over time, reinforcing the sense that the case resisted closure in a fundamental way. And throughout it all, the communications continued. Each new letter reaffirmed the presence of an observer, who remained outside the reach of identification. Someone who not only understood the investigation as it unfolded, but actively engaged with its progress, responding in ways that suggested awareness of investigative pressure and public reaction. This created an unusual dynamic. The investigation was no longer moving in one direction toward the unknown. It was now interacting with something that appeared to be watching it in return. By the end of this phase, investigators were left with an uncomfortable realization. They were not simply searching for a suspect hidden within available evidence. They were searching for a presence that seemed to exist at the edges of every discovery, never fully entering the frame, but never completely absent from it either. And that presence, defined more by its effects than by its identity, remained the central unresolved force driving the entire investigation forward. For a long time, the investigation into the Zodiac case moved in a state that investigators privately described as circular. Evidence appeared to lead forward, but every path eventually bent back into uncertainty. Each new clue created the illusion of proximity, as if resolution was just one step away, only to dissolve again under closer inspection. Then, in the midst of this slow, grinding frustration, a series of developments occurred that felt, at least initially, like a turning point. Not a final answer, but a tightening of focus that suggested the case might finally be converging on something real. The first shift came through the coded messages. Among the letters sent by the offender were encrypted texts that had long resisted interpretation. They were treated as both taunt and puzzle, a demonstration of control over information itself. For months, they remained unsolved, occupying the attention of analysts and amateur cryptographers alike. Then, one of the earlier ciphers was finally broken. The solution did not reveal a name, but it revealed something equally important: confirmation that the messages were not random gibberish or meaningless construction. They were structured, intentional communication. The decoded content contained references to violence and personal ideology, reinforcing the idea that the sender was not only claiming responsibility, but constructing a narrative of identity through language. For investigators, this was significant because it removed one possible explanation, that the communications were purely hoaxes disconnected from the crimes. The cipher proved authorship continuity, at least in the minds of many analysts. However, even this breakthrough had limits. It validated connection, but not identity. It strengthened the case that a single individual was responsible for both crimes and correspondence, but it did not bring that individual any closer to being named. Still, momentum began to shift. The second development came from the refinement of witness descriptions. Over time, as interviews were reanalyzed and inconsistencies accounted for, a more stable composite picture began to emerge. Witnesses from different incidents, despite variations in memory, consistently described certain overlapping traits. A sense of medium build. A calm, controlled manner of movement. An absence of visible panic during transitions into violence. These were not precise identifiers, but they began to narrow the field of possibilities. At the same time, forensic teams revisited physical evidence from earlier scenes. In one case, partial fingerprints had been recovered from a vehicle. At the time, they were not sufficient for identification, but as databases expanded and comparison methods improved, those prints were re-examined. They still did not produce a definitive match, but they allowed investigators to eliminate certain individuals who had previously been considered possible suspects. This process of elimination, though slow, created a subtle shift in direction. The investigation was no longer purely speculative. It was gradually reducing the number of viable candidates. Then came the most discussed suspect in the entire case, a man whose name would become deeply associated with public theories surrounding the killings. He was not initially identified through a single piece of evidence, but through accumulation of circumstantial factors. His proximity to certain locations, prior behavior patterns, and personal interests aligned in ways that made him difficult to ignore. Investigators interviewed him multiple times. They examined his background, his movements during relevant periods, and his potential access to knowledge that might explain certain aspects of the case. In particular, his familiarity with coded material and interest in cryptographic puzzles drew attention, given the nature of the letters sent by the offender. During questioning, however, there was no confession, no direct admission, and no physical evidence that conclusively tied him to all incidents. This created a situation that is often the most difficult for investigators: a suspect who fits parts of a profile, but cannot be fully anchored to the physical evidence required for prosecution. Despite this, he remained central to investigative focus for years, representing what many believed was the closest the case had come to resolution. Another potential breakthrough emerged from geographic analysis. When the locations of confirmed incidents were plotted more carefully, analysts began to notice patterns in travel accessibility rather than simple proximity. The offender appeared to operate within a network of roads that allowed rapid movement between counties without requiring predictable routes. This suggested familiarity with the region at a functional level, not necessarily as a resident of a single location, but as someone comfortable navigating its infrastructure. This insight shifted investigative thinking away from static profiling and toward behavioral geography. Instead of asking who lived near the crime scenes, investigators began asking who could move between them without attracting attention or leaving traceable patterns. Still, even this refinement did not produce a direct identity. It only narrowed the shape of the unknown. The most dramatic moment of perceived progress came when investigators revisited the final known attack in the sequence involving the taxi driver in San Francisco. This case had always stood apart due to its urban setting and the level of detail available from witnesses in the surrounding area. Because it occurred in a more populated environment, there were more potential observations of movement before and after the incident. Several individuals reported seeing a man matching a general description walking away from the area shortly after the event. While these accounts varied slightly, they contributed to a timeline that was more detailed than in earlier cases. Investigators attempted to reconstruct the path taken after the incident, tracing possible escape routes through the city grid. For a brief period, it appeared that a coherent path might emerge. A direction of travel, a possible transition point, a narrowing corridor of movement. But as with earlier efforts, the trail eventually fragmented. The density of the urban environment, which initially seemed helpful, introduced too many overlapping possibilities. Multiple individuals matched partial descriptions. Streets offered too many branching options. Certainty dissolved into probability. Even so, this case reinforced a critical idea. The offender was capable of adapting to entirely different environments, from remote roads to dense city streets, without leaving a consistent trace that could be followed linearly. At this stage in the investigation, a subtle but important change occurred in how law enforcement viewed the case. There was a growing recognition that traditional investigative methods, while still essential, might not be sufficient on their own. The offender was not behaving in a way that aligned neatly with standard criminal profiles. There was adaptability, psychological engagement, and a clear awareness of how information itself influenced investigation. This led to an increased focus on behavioral analysis. Specialists began examining not just what the offender did, but how he responded to public reaction. The timing of letters, the content of messages, and the escalation of symbolic identity all suggested a feedback loop between action and attention. The offender was not isolated from the investigation. He appeared to be interacting with it indirectly. This realization was unsettling, because it implied that the investigation itself might be part of the offender's psychological structure. Meanwhile, public pressure continued to build. Media coverage intensified, and with it came both assistance and interference. Tips flooded in, some valuable, many misleading. Every new theory circulated widely, often outpacing official verification. This created an environment where investigators had to move not only against the unknown offender, but also through a landscape saturated with speculation. Despite all of this, there was a brief period during which optimism within investigative circles increased. The combination of cipher resolution, suspect evaluation, and geographic narrowing created a sense that progress, while slow, was real. Some believed that if enough small breakthroughs accumulated, they might eventually converge into a definitive identification. But the case resisted convergence. Each apparent breakthrough carried within it a limitation that prevented full resolution. The cipher confirmed communication, but not identity. The suspect matched patterns, but lacked definitive evidence. The geographic analysis narrowed movement, but not personhood. Every advancement reduced uncertainty slightly, but never eliminated it. In hindsight, what appeared as a breakthrough was more accurately a refinement of boundaries rather than a collapse of mystery. The unknown area became smaller, but it never disappeared. And within that remaining space, the central problem persisted. The offender remained unlocated not because there was no information, but because the information itself refused to align into a single, provable identity. By the end of this phase, investigators were left with a difficult realization. They were not dealing with a case that lacked evidence. They were dealing with a case where evidence existed in multiple forms, but refused to converge into a legally actionable whole. The breakthrough, such as it was, did not solve the case. It only clarified how deeply the case resisted being solved at all. By the time the investigation reached what many expected to be the stage of resolution, the atmosphere around the case had already changed from urgency into something closer to legal frustration. In most criminal cases, the path eventually narrows into a courtroom, where evidence is presented in structured form, witnesses are examined under oath, and competing interpretations are forced into a single decisive outcome. But in this case, that structure never fully materialized. The case did not arrive at a courtroom in the way people imagined it would. Instead, it hovered just outside of it, repeatedly approaching the threshold of formal charges without ever crossing into them. Law enforcement agencies had by this point accumulated a large volume of investigative material. There were case files spanning years, ballistic reports, survivor statements, handwriting analyses, and psychological profiles. There were also the letters, which continued to exist as a parallel narrative that both supported and complicated the physical investigation. Yet when prosecutors reviewed the totality of evidence, a consistent problem emerged. The material suggested connections, but it did not produce the kind of certainty required for indictment. In criminal justice systems, suspicion is not enough. Patterns are not enough. Even strong behavioral alignment is not enough. What is required is direct linkage, something that places an individual at the scene of the crime in a way that cannot reasonably be explained away. That link never fully appeared in the Zodiac investigation. Despite this, several suspects were subjected to formal scrutiny. Among them, one individual would become the most discussed in both investigative circles and public discourse. He was repeatedly questioned, his background examined in detail, his movements reconstructed over relevant periods of time, and his personal history analyzed for possible connections to the attacks. He had been in proximity to areas relevant to certain incidents, and there were aspects of his profile that aligned with behavioral interpretations developed by investigators. This individual, Arthur Lee Allen, became a central figure in the search for accountability, not because of a single definitive piece of evidence, but because of the accumulation of circumstantial points that appeared to converge in his direction. Investigators explored his habits, his interests, and his possible familiarity with symbolic communication systems similar to those seen in the letters. They also examined whether he could plausibly have had access to information that matched details referenced by the offender. However, as the case moved closer to formal legal thresholds, each promising lead encountered the same structural barrier. Physical evidence did not align cleanly. Witness descriptions did not provide definitive identification. Forensic material, including fingerprints and other trace data, remained inconclusive or insufficiently matched. Without that final connective layer, prosecutors were unable to move forward with charges that would hold in court. This gap between investigative belief and legal proof became the defining tension of the case. At the same time, law enforcement faced increasing pressure from the public and media to bring the case to closure. The longer the case remained unresolved, the more it transformed from an active investigation into a cultural fixation. Newspapers revisited old details. Documentaries reconstructed timelines. Public theories multiplied. Each new interpretation added emotional weight to the idea that justice was within reach, even when legal structures indicated otherwise. Inside investigative offices, this pressure translated into repeated re-evaluations of existing evidence. Teams would revisit earlier assumptions, re-examine old reports, and test alternative theories against the known facts. But the results remained consistent. Every path that seemed to lead toward courtroom readiness eventually encountered a missing element. A witness could not be definitively placed. A piece of physical evidence could not be conclusively matched. A timeline contained too many gaps to establish certainty beyond reasonable doubt. In one sense, the case was heavily documented. In another sense, it was structurally incomplete. There were also legal complications tied to jurisdiction. The crimes occurred across multiple counties, each with its own investigative authority. Evidence was not always collected under unified protocols. Some early forensic opportunities were limited by the technology of the time. In later years, as methods improved, reanalysis was attempted, but degradation of physical evidence reduced the possibility of new definitive results. The passage of time itself became an obstacle to justice. Even the communications attributed to the offender, while psychologically compelling, presented challenges in court. They demonstrated knowledge and intent, but they did not function as direct legal confessions that could be reliably tied to a specific individual. Without corroboration through physical evidence, they remained persuasive, but not prosecutable on their own. As investigative focus narrowed further on primary suspects, legal teams began to assess the viability of bringing a case to grand jury review. In theory, a grand jury could evaluate whether sufficient evidence existed to indict. In practice, however, prosecutors remained hesitant. The risk of presenting an incomplete case was significant. If a grand jury declined to indict, it would not only stall progress, but potentially weaken future attempts. This cautious approach meant that despite decades of investigation, no formal trial ever took place for the crimes attributed to Zodiac. The absence of trial created a psychological imbalance in the public understanding of the case. People naturally expect that serious crimes eventually lead to courtroom resolution. The legal system is structured around the idea that investigation culminates in judgment. But here, that structure was interrupted. There was investigation without adjudication, evidence without verdict, and suspicion without legal closure. For victims' families, this absence carried a particular weight. Without trial, there was no structured narrative of accountability. No official determination of responsibility. No moment where evidence was publicly tested and conclusions formally declared. Instead, there was only the ongoing presence of uncertainty, sustained across decades. Inside law enforcement, the lack of resolution also created a different kind of burden. Investigators moved on to other cases, but the Zodiac file remained open in a symbolic sense, revisited periodically when new methods or technologies became available. Each return to the case brought hope that time might have revealed something previously hidden. Yet each return also reinforced how little had fundamentally changed. The most persistent challenge remained identity. Not just identifying a suspect, but establishing a chain of evidence that could survive legal scrutiny. The difference between investigative confidence and prosecutorial certainty is often subtle in public perception, but in practice it is absolute. One can suggest, infer, and strongly believe. The other must prove beyond reasonable doubt. The Zodiac case never crossed that threshold. As years passed, even advanced forensic methods, such as improved fingerprint analysis and later DNA testing, were applied to available evidence. However, the limitations of preserved materials from the late 1960s reduced the effectiveness of these techniques. Many samples were degraded, incomplete, or contaminated by time and handling. The promise of modern science provided hope, but not resolution. Meanwhile, the cultural presence of the case continued to grow. The figure of the unknown offender became more widely recognized than the legal reality of the investigation. In films, books, and discussions, the idea of Zodiac as an almost mythic criminal presence took shape, often detached from the procedural limitations that defined the actual investigation. Within law enforcement circles, this mythologizing created a quiet tension. On one hand, it kept public attention on the case, which sometimes generated new leads. On the other hand, it risked oversimplifying the complexity of the investigation itself, reducing it to a narrative of near-mystical elusiveness rather than acknowledging the very real procedural constraints that prevented resolution. Despite this, investigators continued to emphasize one central point internally. The case was not unsolved due to lack of effort or lack of intelligence. It remained unsolved because the necessary convergence of evidence had never occurred in a legally usable form. Every investigative branch pointed toward possibility, but none converged into certainty. As a result, the courtroom phase that defines most criminal cases never arrived. There was no trial where evidence was presented in full. No jury weighing competing interpretations. No final judgment delivered through legal process. Instead, the case remained in an extended investigative state, suspended between suspicion and proof, never fully transitioning into adjudication. In that absence, the idea of justice itself became complicated. Justice in a legal sense requires closure. It requires finality. But in this case, finality was never achieved. The system could not complete its function, not because it failed in effort, but because the structure of available evidence did not support completion. And so the investigation remained open in spirit, even as it closed in practice. The figure known as Zodiac, whether understood as one individual or a constructed identity, never appeared in a courtroom, never faced cross-examination, and never received a formal verdict. His presence existed entirely outside the space where justice is usually defined. What remained instead was a record of pursuit without conclusion, a legal structure that approached certainty, but never reached it, and a system of investigation that continued to point toward an answer it could not fully articulate. In the end, the absence of a trial did not simply mark a procedural gap. It became part of the case itself, defining it as much as any piece of evidence ever did. In the years that followed the formal stagnation of the investigation, the Zodiac case slowly transformed into something it was never originally intended to become. What began as a series of violent incidents in Northern California evolved into a long-term psychological presence embedded in public consciousness, law enforcement history, and cultural memory. The absence of resolution did not cause the case to fade. Instead, it caused it to settle into a different form, one that existed simultaneously as unsolved crime, ongoing speculation, and enduring fear. In most criminal investigations, closure functions as a boundary. Once a suspect is identified, prosecuted, and judged, the case is effectively sealed. It becomes history. But in this situation, that boundary never formed. The investigation remained technically open, even as active pursuit diminished over time. Files were archived, then reopened, then re-examined again years later as technology advanced. Each return to the evidence created the possibility of discovery, but also reinforced the reality that time had already altered what could be recovered. The passage of decades introduced a quiet, but irreversible shift. Physical environments changed. Roads were redesigned. Urban expansion transformed the geography of Northern California. Places that once felt remote became more developed, while others that were once familiar disappeared entirely under layers of infrastructure and growth. The landscape that had once hosted the original events no longer existed in the same form, making spatial reconstruction increasingly abstract. Yet despite this transformation, the psychological weight of the case remained anchored to the past. For the families of victims, time did not produce distance in the way it often does in other contexts. Instead, it created a suspended condition, where grief and uncertainty continued to coexist. Without a trial or formal conviction, there was no definitive moment that transformed loss into concluded history. The absence of final legal acknowledgement meant that questions persisted in a space that was both emotional and procedural. Each anniversary, each media update, and each renewed public discussion reopened a reality that had never been fully closed. Inside law enforcement agencies, the case became something closer to institutional memory than active investigation. Detectives who had worked the original files retired, passed them on, or revisited them years later as consultants. New generations of investigators encountered the case not as an unfolding event, but as a historical puzzle with incomplete documentation. The shift in perspective changed how the case was approached. It was no longer driven by urgency, but by the possibility that modern tools might extract meaning from old evidence. Advancements in forensic science brought renewed attention to the case at various points. Techniques that did not exist during the original investigation were applied to preserved materials. DNA analysis, enhanced fingerprint comparison, and digital reconstruction methods offered new ways of interpreting old data. However, the limitations of preservation from the late 1960s remained a significant barrier. Many samples had degraded over time. Others had been exposed to conditions that made reliable analysis impossible. The expectation that modern science would finally resolve the case repeatedly encountered the reality of incomplete material. Even so, these attempts were not without value. They confirmed certain exclusions, refined existing assumptions, and eliminated possibilities that had once remained open. But elimination is not resolution. It narrows the field without revealing what remains at its center. As the case transitioned further into cultural memory, its identity began to shift away from purely investigative relevance. The figure known as Zodiac became a symbol of unresolved mystery, referenced in films, books, documentaries, and academic discussions. The symbol he used in correspondence became widely recognized, detached from its original context and repurposed as a representation of unsolved criminal ambiguity. This cultural transformation created an unusual dynamic. The case existed simultaneously in two parallel forms. In one, it remained a real investigation grounded in evidence, jurisdictional boundaries, and procedural limitations. In the other, it existed as a narrative structure shaped by interpretation, speculation, and artistic representation. These two versions did not always align, and the gap between them widened over time. Public fascination with the case often focused on the idea of identity. Who was the offender? What motivated him? How could someone operate across multiple environments without being definitively identified? These questions persisted not only because they were unanswered, but because they touched on deeper anxieties about visibility, anonymity, and control in modern society. The idea that someone could construct an identity through both action and communication, while remaining physically unconfirmed, challenged conventional expectations of criminal resolution. It suggested that identity itself could be fragmented across evidence, perception, and narrative, without ever fully consolidating into a single provable entity. Within academic and psychological discussions, the case became a reference point for studying offender communication, symbolic identity construction, and media interaction. The letters attributed to the offender were analyzed not only for content, but for structure, tone, and intent. They were examined as artifacts of psychological expression as much as investigative evidence. The relationship between violence and communication in the case became a subject of long-term study, influencing how later cases involving public correspondence were understood. Yet even with extensive analysis, the core identity behind the communications remained unverified. Over time, multiple individuals were proposed, examined, and debated as possible suspects. Some gained significant public attention, particularly those whose backgrounds aligned partially with investigative profiles. Others were considered briefly before being excluded based on evidence or lack thereof. Each generation of analysis produced renewed interest, but no definitive conclusion. The most enduring characteristic of the case was not any single piece of evidence, but the structural absence of convergence. Every investigative path, no matter how promising, eventually encountered a boundary that prevented full resolution. It was not a failure of effort, but a limitation imposed by the nature of available information. As a result, the case developed a unique position in criminal history. It became an example of sustained unresolved investigation, despite extensive documentation and long-term attention. This status reinforced its cultural presence while simultaneously highlighting the limitations of retrospective analysis in complex, multi-jurisdictional cases. In the broader context of law enforcement history, the case influenced procedural approaches to communication-based offenders. The importance of analyzing written material alongside physical evidence became more widely recognized. Coordination between jurisdictions improved in later decades, partially as a response to difficulties encountered during investigations of this nature. The case, in that sense, contributed indirectly to the evolution of investigative practice. Still, these developments did not alter the fundamental outcome. No individual was ever formally convicted in relation to the series of crimes attributed to the Zodiac case. No courtroom judgment was delivered. No legal closure was achieved. The investigation remained, in official terms, open or unresolved, depending on jurisdictional classification and archival status. What remained instead was a layered legacy. At one level, there was the historical record of events, a series of violent incidents that occurred within a specific geographic and temporal frame in Northern California during the late 1960s. At another level, there was the investigative record, thousands of pages of reports, interviews, analyses, and forensic examinations. And at a third level, there was the cultural record, interpretations, representations, and symbolic adaptations that transformed the case into a broader narrative about mystery and unresolved identity. These layers did not replace each other. They coexisted, often in tension. For those who study the case today, whether professionally or out of personal interest, the challenge lies in navigating these layers without conflating them. The temptation to treat narrative coherence as equivalent to factual completion is strong, especially in a case that has generated so many interpretations. But the historical reality remains resistant to narrative closure. The absence of a final answer does not mean the absence of investigation. It means that investigation and conclusion were never successfully bridged. In reflecting on the long arc of the case, one of the most striking aspects is not only the identity of the offender remaining unknown, but the way in which that unknown identity influenced systems around it. Law enforcement structures adapted. Media practices evolved. Public perception of unsolved crime shifted. The case exerted influence far beyond its immediate geographic and temporal boundaries. Even today, the figure known as Zodiac exists less as a confirmed individual and more as a framework through which questions about anonymity, communication, and investigative limitation are explored. He represents not only an unresolved offender, but also the boundaries of what can be known when evidence is incomplete and time has eroded the conditions under which events originally occurred. In that sense, the aftermath of the case is not simply the period after the crimes. It is an ongoing state defined by continued inquiry, without final resolution. The investigation did not end with an answer. It ended with persistence. And persistence, in this case, became its defining legacy. By the time new generations of investigators began revisiting the Zodiac case, the file no longer felt like an active wound in the system of law enforcement. It had become something closer to a sealed container that could still be opened, but only with difficulty, and only to reveal materials already aged by time. Yet what made the case unusual was that it never truly settled into obscurity. Unlike many cold cases that fade into archival silence, this one continued to breathe through periodic rediscovery, driven by advances in forensic science, renewed public interest, and the persistent human discomfort with unresolved narratives. When modern investigators reopen sections of the case file, they were often struck first not by what was present, but by what was missing. Documentation standards from the late 1960s and early 1970s were inconsistent by modern expectations. Chain of custody records were incomplete in certain instances. Evidence handling procedures varied between jurisdictions. Some materials had been preserved with care, while others had deteriorated or been lost entirely during transfers, storage changes, or simple administrative oversight. This uneven preservation created a foundational problem for any attempt at modern reanalysis. In forensic science, continuity is essential. Without it, even the most advanced techniques can only operate on partial inputs. DNA analysis, for example, requires not just biological material, but material that has remained uncontaminated and viable through decades of environmental exposure. In many of the Zodiac-related scenes, this requirement could not be met. Still, investigators persisted. One of the most significant efforts in later years involved re-examining preserved physical evidence using technologies that did not exist during the original investigation. Items that had once been catalogued and stored were subjected to new forms of analysis, including enhanced imaging techniques and improved fingerprint comparison systems. Each reanalysis carried the hope that time might have hidden something that earlier methods could not detect. But time, in this case, was not neutral. It was erosive. Materials that had once held potential evidentiary value often returned inconclusive results. Partial prints remained partial. Trace evidence remained insufficiently specific. Even when small advancements were made, such as clearer visualization of patterns or improved exclusion of certain individuals, they rarely moved the case closer to definitive identification. Despite these limitations, each technological revisit reinforced an important truth: the case was not lacking in investigation, but in recoverable continuity. Parallel to forensic efforts, behavioral analysis also evolved. Modern profiling techniques, informed by decades of accumulated psychological research, offered new frameworks for interpreting offender communication. Analysts revisited the letters attributed to the Zodiac with fresh perspectives, focusing not only on content, but on structure, repetition, and rhetorical posture. What became increasingly apparent through this lens was that the communications were not simply informational or confessional. They were performative. The writer was not only describing actions, but shaping perception of those actions. There was a consistent emphasis on control over narrative, particularly in how information was released, withheld, or distorted across different letters. This suggested a psychological orientation that extended beyond the crimes themselves. The offender appeared to derive meaning not only from the acts attributed to him, but from the reaction those acts generated. The interaction between public fear, media amplification, and official investigation seemed to form part of the behavioral system itself. This interpretation, however, remained theoretical. Without direct identification of the individual responsible, psychological analysis could only describe patterns, not origins. As investigative techniques improved, public expectations also evolved. Each announcement of renewed testing or reanalysis sparked speculation that resolution was imminent. Media coverage often framed these efforts in terms of breakthroughs, even when internal investigative assessments were far more cautious. This gap between public perception and procedural reality became a recurring feature of the case in its later decades. In reality, most modern forensic revisits produced incremental rather than transformative results. They refined understanding without fundamentally altering conclusions. They could eliminate possibilities, but they struggled to establish new certainties. One of the more persistent lines of inquiry involved attempts to reconcile earlier suspect evaluations with modern data. Individuals who had once been central to investigative attention were re-examined under updated criteria. This included reviewing past interviews, reassessing alibis in light of new contextual information, and comparing historical behavioral profiles with contemporary psychological models. Yet even in cases where strong circumstantial alignment existed, the absence of definitive physical linkage remained decisive. The legal threshold for conviction had not changed, even if investigative tools had improved. Without that threshold being met, suspects remained just that, suspects. Over time, this reality led to a gradual shift in how the case was framed within law enforcement institutions. Rather than a problem awaiting solution, it became a case study in investigative limitation. Training materials referenced it not for what it revealed about the offender, but for what it demonstrated about the boundaries of evidence-based reconstruction in the absence of complete data. Outside of official institutions, the case continued to evolve in public imagination. Online communities, independent researchers, and amateur analysts produced extensive reconstructions, alternative theories, and comparative studies. Some of these efforts demonstrated impressive attention to detail, incorporating archival research and forensic understanding. Others leaned heavily into speculation, filling gaps with narrative assumptions. This duality created a unique cultural ecosystem around the case. It existed simultaneously as historical investigation and as open interpretive field. Unlike cases with definitive resolution, where analysis eventually converges toward established truth, this one remained open-ended, allowing continuous reinterpretation. Within this environment, new theories about identity periodically emerged. Some focused on individuals previously overlooked. Others proposed more complex scenarios involving multiple offenders, or broader networks of coordination. Each theory attempted, in its own way, to resolve the central tension of the case, the coexistence of detailed evidence and absent identity. Yet despite the diversity of interpretations, none achieved universal acceptance. The absence of definitive proof ensured that every theory remained provisional. One of the more enduring aspects of modern discussion involved the relationship between communication and investigation. The Zodiac letters, once viewed primarily as taunts or confessions, became central artifacts in understanding how offenders might interact with investigative systems. They demonstrated how communication could function as both evidence and interference, simultaneously aiding and complicating investigative progress. In particular, the timing of the letters in relation to investigative developments became a focal point of analysis. The perception that the writer was responding to media coverage or police activity suggested a feedback loop between investigation and offender behavior. This idea influenced later investigative approaches to similar cases involving public communication. However, even this insight did not translate into identification. It explained interaction patterns without revealing the actor behind them. As decades passed, the physical landscapes associated with the original crimes also changed significantly. Urban expansion, environmental shifts, and infrastructural development altered or erased many of the original reference points. Roads were widened, areas were redeveloped, and in some cases, natural environments changed in ways that made precise reconstruction increasingly difficult. This environmental transformation added another layer of abstraction to the case. Investigators attempting to revisit scenes were often doing so in spaces that no longer resembled their historical conditions. This made spatial analysis more challenging and reduced the reliability of environmental reconstruction as an investigative tool. Despite all of these challenges, interest in the case never fully diminished. Instead, it stabilized into a long-term equilibrium between investigation, speculation, and cultural memory. Periodic spikes in attention occurred whenever new analytical techniques were applied, or when anniversaries prompted reflection. Each resurgence reinforced the idea that the case remained unresolved not due to neglect, but due to structural limitations in evidence convergence. Ultimately, what defines the modern state of the Zodiac investigation is not the presence of new breakthroughs, but the persistence of old boundaries. The same core issues remain intact: incomplete physical evidence, lack of definitive identification, and the absence of legal resolution. Everything built upon the case since then exists within those constraints. In the end, the case stands as an extended demonstration of how complex investigations can persist without closure, even under decades of attention and technological advancement. It is not a story that ends with discovery. It is a story that continues because discovery, in its complete form, has never fully arrived.